What's good, everybody? It's your boy Big Nate. Welcome back to Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews, and today we have a dope-ass video. Today we are talking about On the Shortness of Life by Lucius Annaeus Seneca, one of the OG GOAT Stoic philosophers. Stoicism is one of my favorite branches of philosophy, and this, I would argue, is a seminal Stoic text. So we got a dope-ass episode in store. You already know what to do. I got my cup of coffee. I've switched to tea for these episodes, lavender berry. So I got my cup of tea, I got my doobie. If you're Big Nate gang, duh, you already know what to do. And without further ado, I'm gonna spark this and let's get into the review. Okay, so first let's clear the elephant in the room here. This is technically like an essay. It's actually really technically a letter from Seneca to his friend Paulinus. But because, as you can see, it is bound in book form, it's under the purview of Big Nate's book reviews, so we are going to talk about it. And I wanted to mention briefly too, just like my background with like Stoicism. Stoicism is a branch of philosophy to me, which is like the first one I can think of that had a direct, like, actual impact on how I live my day-to-day life. Stoicism to me actually is just the philosophy of how to live. And I first encountered not only Seneca, but I would say Stoicism in general, in actually a class I took in undergrad, the philosophy of happiness, which so much good shit. Honestly, fantastic class. I took away so much from those readings that I keep with me still to this day. But Seneca was, of course, among them, and his texts were among some of my favorite that we read throughout that whole class. So I since have read, of course, more of Seneca, and when I saw this, On the Shortness of Life, mandatory cop. That was a mandatory cop. Okay, but without further ado, let's get into like the actual text itself. So this essay basically, it begins by laying out what I'll just call like the problem of the shortness of life. And he's writing to his friend Paulinus, and he says, most people complain about the meanness of nature, he says, because life just exists for what seems like such a brief span of time, and our lives passes by so fast that it seems like for most of us, life ceases just as we are beginning to live it. And honestly, that has been resonating, that's been hitting with me lately, because I just turned 28, yes, old head unk status, and it's just like, when I was reading this text, I kind of did the calculation. I'm like, I'm literally assuming I live a long life, I've lived over a third of my life. And you know, that last third is going to be old age, which, if the people on the channel, if you know, Cicero, he painted that in a different light. It won't be so bad, actually. But just in general, the fact that so much of my life has passed by, on the one hand, it feels like an infinite wealth of experience and memory, and just, you know, it's been an incredibly rich time of my life. And yet it also feels like the whole thing is just passed by in the snap of a finger. You tell me the second third is gonna, in fact, I think there's even like, I don't know if there's like studies, but like the older you get, the faster time seems to pass. I think it's even like follows a logarithmic shape. Don't hold me to that. But anyway, all of that also reminds me of another book that I've talked about on the channel, OG Big Nate gang will have known, 4,000 Weeks. And that was, you know, as the title kind of suggests as well, like, if you live to have a long life, not even an average life, like literally on the longer, I forget exactly, like let's just say like 80, something like that, you have about 4,000 weeks to live. And just that image, like, because it's not that right there is another way of formulating the shortness of life, because 4,000 weeks, and again, I've used a third of those, is not that long of a time. But Seneca's whole argument basically to his friend Paulinus is, it's not that our lives are short, but that we waste a lot of it. So he says, just as an ample and princely wealth, if it follows to a bad manager of it, it will be squandered in an instant. And it reminds me of people like lottery winners, how they'll win tens of hundreds of millions of dollars and somehow they end up, you know, bankrupt. Just as a bad manager of money will squander it in an instant, so too are there those who, if they receive any amount of wealth, no matter how modest, if they are good custodians of it, they will maintain it, and if anything, increase it. And Seneca basically says, so too with life. In a certain sense, if you are a good custodian of your time, you can make the most of it, and in some way, he says, extend it. And yet, he says, most of us treat our lives and time as if we had an overflowing and abundant supply, whereas meanwhile today could very well be, you know, essentially your last day of life. And it's the people who squander their time, it's those same people who, that if they're threatened with death, he says, like if they have some kind of disease or affliction, they are going to be the first ones praying to doctors, willing to give up every ounce of their worldly possessions simply so that they may have more life. And yet it's these same people who are in their everyday lives just squandering all of their time. And he says, imagine if we had a tally of our lives and how alarmed those people would be who only had a few years left to live. The fact that there is a tally at all shows you that life is finite. And then again, how preciously those people, which probabilistically, I don't know about someone watching this video, but just in the earth, there are people right now, there's a lot of people who are in that same position where in the next few years, their tally is very small, put it that way. And this is why Seneca too, one of his, I think like take home messages you could say, is that he's like, he thinks, he even says the word, my translation, it's like the stupidest use of time to put things off to the future. So in the sense it's like, you're like, one day I'll write a book, one day I'll start a business, one day I'll go back to school, you know, all that, you know, and people, they say like, oh, I'll do that when I retire. But in the meantime, I'm gonna do the rat race. This is what Seneca says is the biggest waste of life. He says it snatches away each day as it comes and denies us the present by promising us the future. But the thing with the future is that it lies in complete uncertainty. Therefore, he says, live immediately. And I love that phrase, live immediately. For those who are living in the present moment, he says, they neither long for nor fear the next day, for what new pleasure can any hour now bring? And the way I've been thinking about it, it's like if you're living in the fullness of the present moment, you are not worried about the so-called shortness of life. And this is just one example of the many bangers that come not only from Seneca, but just Stoicism in general. So I'm very glad I read this because it was a nice little refresher. It's been a while since I visited a Stoic text. So, and one thing in this that really hit for me personally, like especially lately, let's just say especially lately, is this idea how much of our life is wasted by society and work and social expectations. And he starts by saying, you know, you will be hard pressed to find anybody who just gives out their money willy-nilly and is not protective of their own personal properties. And yet when it comes to time, when it comes to squandering time, they're the most wasteful of the one thing it is right to be stingy for. And he says, I am always surprised to find how willingly people will just, for one, demand the time of other people, and also how easily those people acquiesce to it as if nothing were being asked for and nothing given. When you do give up your time for somebody else, that is a sort of transaction or exchange that takes place. But because we don't, he has a great line. He says, you are trifling with life's most precious commodity, being deceived because it is an intangible thing, not open to inspection and therefore reckoned very cheap. And that's the line I'm busting out next time my boss asks me to join another weekly meeting. I said, you are trifling with life's most precious commodity. But that is fact. It's basically like, because we don't see time like money or, you know, personal possessions, because it's an intangible thing, we reckon it very cheap. Whereas again, as Seneca points out, this is what I love about Stoic stuff. This is like a good example of a true insight in philosophy. The idea that your time and your life is the absolute most precious commodity to y'all. And then when you start thinking about society, you know, how much of your life you have to give up in work, it's like there's an exchange taking place there where you're basically selling your life for labor to make, like, if you're $20 an hour. I mean, that's probably an overestimate for some people. But you just, again, when you think about it in that way, that's the perspective that, one, this essay, but maybe all of Stoicism does in general. There's a big emphasis on death and, like, you know, stuff like that. And Seneca says, come now, hold an audit on your life. See how much of your days have been divided between the money lender and the patron and the client and the mistress and dashing about the city on your obligations. This is what I mean. There's two parts to this for me. Like, one, the idea that there's nothing new under the sun. Like, obviously in the modern world, we have so many more distractions pulling at us this way. Instant email, text, like, you know, instant access to one another, the internet, all of that has changed everything. And yet it's just funny to see like the very same things he's talking about in ancient Rome have like the modern analogs today. He says the money lender, that's the bank. He says the client, that's your job. The patron, the mistress, all these dashing about the city on your social obligations. All of this just, I don't know about you guys, but rings very true to me. All of it just kind of points to me like there's certain universal human principles that are true throughout all of time. That's why things like the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Upanishads, ancient texts, still like perfectly describe, and why we still have such a fascination with them to this day. But why don't you let me know in the comments, do you think we have it worse now in modern day, or is it the same as in ancient Rome? But getting back to what Seneca says about holding an audit on your life, he says you will find you have far fewer days than you thought where your day actually went as you had planned. Like he said, where your face is able to wear its natural expression and your mind was undisturbed. He says if you hold that, if you see how many few days there are, you are dying prematurely. And it's so true. Like, how many days do you truly have where you can live it exactly as how you want it to? And your face could wear, I love that phrase, it could wear its natural expression. Like, you're not in a meeting, you're not with your boss, you're not outside running errands. Seneca says, mark off, I tell you, the days of your life, and you will find that very few, the useless remnants, have been left to you. And I love that phrase too, the useless remnants, because that's literally, I've been feeling that particularly much lately, because you wake up, like, if you're an average person, this is how your day goes. You wake up, you immediately pretty much start getting ready for work. You got like breakfast, gotta get dressed, you commute to work. That is the whole thing in itself. Then you're there for 9 hours. Again, remember, there's an exchange happening there. You're 9 hours of your life every day, 5 days a week. Then you got to drive home. You're starving. You make dinner. You have to you got to clean the kitchen and shit. By the time you finally sit down, your creative energies are totally spent. And if you're lucky, you basically have like a couple hours to yourself, you know, for that day before you wake up and do it again. 5 days a week. And then finally it's Saturday. You have 1 day to yourself. Half the time you have to spend doing errands, shit you couldn't do during the week. Saturday comes and goes. You needed that. That was just to get you started. Then it's Sunday. Oh my God, you already worked the next day. Like, you can't even stay up late on Sunday. So this is what Seneca means. This is what I feel when he says the useless remnants. Like, these are the useless remnants of our life left to us by the modern world. And honestly, I could see an argument that through, like, you know, this hyper capitalist shit we got going on, they're just trying to squeeze out more and more and more. I could see that we do have more demands, and like everything he's saying, still a general principle, just amplified to the limit. It feels like, I don't know how much longer we can do this, fam, but that does bring us to our next point, kind of, not really actually, but what I think is, like, for the time that we do have left to ourselves, how much of it we spent in like the distracting nature of different vices and, you know, like things like social media and just like kind of stupid television, drugs, alcohol, anything that takes you away from living fully in the present moment. And he says for people that live a distracted life like this, their lives are, it doesn't matter if they're over 1,000 years old. He said all of that will shrink to the tiniest span. Those vices will swallow up any space of time. And it's almost like Buddhist samsaric in the way it's just like this endless cycle of pleasure and suffering. Like, more pleasure begets more pleasure to the point that it almost reaches a point of suffering. And I feel like that actually, to a point of suffering, describes almost perfectly actually like social media. It's like pleasure in the sense of like dopamine, stimulation, funny stuff, but if you do it long enough, it becomes no longer fun. But that's what he means by those vices will swallow up any space of time. The way you're scrolling social media, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, okay, turns to 20, 30, ooh, we're at 45, if God forbid we at an hour. And it's like Seneca says, their lives vanish into an abyss, just as there is no use pouring any amount of liquid into a container if there's no bottom with which to catch and hold it. So too does it not matter how much time we have if there is nowhere for it to settle. He says it falls through the cracks and holes of the mind. And I feel like when you go on social media and you just go dumb, or if you watch too much, you binge too much stupid shit, it does feel like a part of your life has slipped through, escaped through the cracks and holes of your mind. And then Seneca says, just as the traveler who is beguiled in some kind of conversation, or they get super into their book, or they're just in some profound meditation, lost in thought, and they arrive at their destination before they even knew that they had arrived or that they were approaching, so too is it with these people who live their lives in this distracted way. Their lives pass them by the time they finally look up from whatever it is that was distracting them. They're already at their destination, that is to say death. And so that, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is On the Shortness of Life by Seneca. So let me know what you think about any of this stuff I've talked about, any other texts by Seneca, any other texts by Stoic philosophers, just anything related to this discussion. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews. Follow me on Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews. Get to the second channel while we're at it, The Big Nate Review. And thank you for watching Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews.